if the reporting in the Washington Post and now the New York Times is accurate, part of the way to keep the president safer was to keep all of those more than 100 people on Air Force One still in the sights of whoever was trying to get at the president. In other words, if anybody was going to be killed, it was going to be the people left on Air Force One who were, according to these reports, being used as a decoy. In other words, they were going to die in place of the president if things unfolded that way. That's deeply troubling.
A completely fascinating investigation has revealed a clandestine operation involving the US president. The Washington Post first reported details as to how President Trump hid in a catering lorry and used a decoy plane to mitigate an Iranian assassination threat last month. Stephen Cash is a former CIA intelligence officer and is now executive director of The Steady State, and he's with us now. Stephen, welcome to the programme.
Good to be here, Calum. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. It's great to speak to you. First of all, can you help us understand then, at the risk of asking a silly question, but just put it into context, how serious a threat this must have been to keep the president off the famously safe Air Force One?
Ordinarily, I would say it must be a serious threat. That's a very big deal, moving the president around. I think the problem we now have is we have found that reports from the executive branch here in the United States of what the intelligence is saying or not saying, and the sort of the drama around President Trump as this very important person who could be in danger makes us question everything. So it's not such a silly question you ask, but let's keep the assumption that it was a real threat that needed a real response to keep the president of the United States safe.
Why then would they, I suppose, why would they trump this up? What are your concerns about what we know about this? Why are you sceptical, I suppose?
Well, we've had a long series of particularly the president, but also his cronies in the White House, misrepresenting U.S. intelligence, most notably just a couple of weeks ago when he gave his primetime address to the American people from the White House and talked about threats from the Chinese, threats from the Venezuelans, all based on supposed intelligence products, which he posted on the website, by the way. But then when you read them, they didn't really say what he said they said. So I think that we're now building into every time that we hear the White House talk about what the intelligence is saying, we have to take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah. What do you make of the idea that within this reporting that Trump may have been taken off the plane, but staff, journalists, clearly a flight crew as well, still had to pilot it? There's an interesting question here about security over transparency for those who were effectively being used as a decoy.
Yes. And you put your finger on two elements that are critical here. So let's first talk about the lack of transparency. There is actually a regulation that governs the United States intelligence community. It's called ICD 191. That sounds very technical. It's called the duty to warn obligation. And basically, when U.S. intelligence gets information that some people, any people, groups of people, individuals, are in danger, they have to be warned, except in very specific situations where there can be a waiver. So the idea is if the U.S. government and its intelligence organizations knows that people are in danger, it has to warn them. So first question, and you put your finger on it, was that warning carried out here? We don't know. And the warning doesn't necessarily have to go to the people themselves, but maybe people protecting those people. So maybe some people knew about it. The second issue here is more troubling, and you used the word decoy. And that is something that I'm not sure we've ever dealt with explicitly in recent history in the United States, nor do I think there's a regulation or law that governs it. But your point is, if the reporting in the Washington Post and now the New York Times is accurate, part of the way to keep the president safer was to keep all of those more than 100 people on Air Force One still in the sights of whoever was trying to get at the president. In other words, if anybody was going to be killed, it was going to be the people left on Air Force One who were, according to these reports, being used as a decoy. In other words, they were going to die in place of the president if things unfolded that way. That's deeply troubling.
Yeah, it's astonishing to hear it expressed even by so starkly, but that is the reality of what we're dealing with here. I do wonder how those staff members, journalists and others feel about this now. It's really quite an intriguing story. May I ask as well, I referenced the sort of security measures on Air Force One, which are fairly well known, actually. There's a reasonable amount of publicity about the aeroplane that flies the president around and just how safe and secure it is. But that was before Qatar offered the United States its newest aircraft. And there seems to be some suggestion, actually, about security concerns with that aeroplane. I'm just wondering, the United States seems to have welcomed in a potential security risk.
Well, that's a troubling question, in part because when the president talks about it, it's not clear that gift was to the United States or to him personally.
Indeed.
He's talked about it as if it's his personal plane and he'll get to keep it when he leaves office. So that's a concern to start with. The second issue, and again, you mentioned it, is we've invested a huge amount of money, technology, and smarts into making Air Force One as secure as an airplane probably can be at this time with the technology available. And it sounds like a lot of that was skipped because President Trump wanted a plane that, as he said, is the fanciest plane ever to fly. And he gave people tours of how nice the inside looks. But, bottom line, the inside's not why we invest all that effort. It's to keep the president of the United States alive. It's not just a sort of luxury vehicle for some celebrity. It's a piece of national security equipment. And it appears that a lot of the understanding of how to keep the president safe were just sort of abandoned. We don't know the details of that. And just a few days ago, it became clear that the president was very angry that concern had been reported on and is searching for what he calls leakers. He calls them treasonous, which is a complete misuse of that word. It's a very scary word for an American president to use, while at the same time saying that the reports in the New York Times and Washington Post about the security issues were false, which is like a little bit of a conflict there. And it looks like they have not only fired, but took away the security clearances of a senior Air Force officer who they at least think may have spoken to the press. This is scary times.
Scary times indeed, Stephen. It's a pleasure to speak to you. Thanks very much for joining the programme.
Pleasure to be here, Colin. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. That's Stephen Cash, former CIA intelligence officer and now executive director of the Steady State. It's a remarkable story and remarkable implications as well.